Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you guys for joining. My name is Vanessa Toves, and today we're going to talk about Microsoft 365 and some considerations for when you're developing end-to-end solutions. All right, before we jump into that, I just want to take a minute to thank the organizers of this awesome conference, as well as our sponsors as well. So thank you guys. Thank you so much for putting this on, for your time, your dedication. And let's go jump into it. So my name is Vanessa Toves. I am by trade a Microsoft 365 solution architect. And I've been working with Microsoft technology since the very first version of SharePoint on premises and their BI reporting suite, or their BI tools. And I've kind of followed all of these tools up into the cloud, right? Um, I love sharing what I've learned, and I continue to really enjoy the platform as it grows as well, right? So here we go. So let's talk about this. Let's jump into this. So part of this whole presentation is going to be half, slide deck, and the other half, right? We'll jump into and actually take a look at what this looks like. So, um, what does it mean to be a solution architect? And because I think that's part of what you have to understand is what the roles are. If you think about all of the different jobs that are involved with being a solution architect, it absolutely involves the technology aspect and knowing that. But then there's all the other soft skills, right? The things that you need to know and do before you actually put your hands anywhere in 365. I won't go through every single one of these, but um, one of the things I learned early on in my career, especially, is understanding what this business problem is that you're solving. So you're here to solve a business problem and apply technology to it. Ultimately, the technology doesn't matter if you haven't grasped what the problem is, who's involved, if it's something that was manually done before, what the challenges were that they faced with what it looks like today, and then what is it that they're trying to accomplish, right? So being a business analyst, that's a lot of what you're going to have to do at the very front end. Be a good listener, understanding what these things are so that you can also then eventually know what you need to do, right? Technically make out of anything. I won't go into all the details of this, but there's a lot that you need to know about this business problem before you go. One of the most also important things to know is if no one is asking you to solve a problem and you are building some technology solution, your likelihood of you having long-term adoption of that solution, right, ends up being lower. And that is because of who has to be involved. Right? So think about this very much so that the organization has this problem, individuals in their roles, right, the business owners, the ones that are responsible for this process, this data, that they're the ones that truly own this, and represent this with you, right, to you. So we're going to talk about, as we step through all of these things, various aspects of that. The first one being who's involved, right? Who's going to interact with the solution? The more formal you might be as a business analyst, the more you might actually develop, um, use cases, and various things like that. Sorry about that. But who's going to interact, right? Who's going to deliver some of the data? Who's going to manage it? Who's involved in the process of any approvals? Who needs visibility to this information? If you identify these pieces and these users and what the expectations are as you're developing, you need to be able to accommodate, right, these roles in this solution. So you can't just go and develop something, some text, some flow, and call it good. Now, once again, business analyst aspect of what you're doing is in the requirements part. Turning someone's conversation or an email, right? There's a frustration that's happening. Hey, we can't keep doing this, right? We need to go fix this. That people talk about, the problem, has to be documented. Has to be. You have to extract out of there truly what the process is. Where are the gaps in this process today? How are you doing it? And then one of the easiest ways to do that for me, I've used the swim lane for many years, whether each lane represents an actual person, each lane represents a stage in a process, or each lane can represent the various roles. But if you are developing this solution and you're listening to problems, right, identifying what the current process is, and if you are to replicate that process, you have to put that in front of the business, right, the business owner, the team that you're working with, the management team, not the management of your organization, but the manager, the people that will be managing this solution once you step away, right? You put this back in front of them, and this will open up a lot of conversation. Whether they have access to actually go modify it, if you're going to allow them to do it, that's even better if they can. But once they visualize this, and as part of your documentation and your deliverable to them, right, they'll be able to understand exactly what's going on. It is also a CYA for you in terms of, well, no, that's not what you said, right? What you said was, if no, then do this. If yes, then do this. If this type. So document it. Ultimately, it's not your business process, right? It belongs to the organization. In fact, they may have never documented it. And you could be sitting there being the first to actually put paper to pen or, right, be digital, whatever it may be. Um, and becomes a foundation for you as you begin to frame how you're going to develop something, right? So once again, know the process, know the flow of what it is that you're doing, and push this back on the business users, the team that's managing it, to validate that. And as you're stepping through this, as you're stepping through any one of these, you're going to identify also points of communication. Right? If we go back to this flow, in this chance, right, everything that green is a point of communication. And for me, right, I think about communication in a couple of ways. I'm realistic about understanding where people work. For many years, right, SharePoint was a place where you would put, you might have lists or libraries, it might have reports, but sending people away from a place where they're working just is something, an added step. So if your company uses Teams, right? You can embed the information about a process within the approval flow. Make your titles of things easy so they can actually either one, see it really quickly, and understand what it is that they're being asked to do. But also if you're not a big Teams user and you're just using Outlook, embed the information. If people work in Outlook, and if we want them to move through this process and not want any one individual to be a bottleneck, then they can go back to they look at their email and they click the button, right? Approve, reject, whatever that might be. Versus here's a link, take them to some other place and take them away. And then you have to deal with yet another, right, formatting of that. SharePoint lists are not always that pretty to have to deal with. So communicate to your users. And as you're stepping through, building these assets of requirements, one of the things as I mentioned before, I've got this email, all these greens are email communications. Well, one of the things I'll develop is a document. I just create a document and I build out a template of, what the communication is. And I'll have an H1 or H2 for the title, this step, right? This person gets it, who the to is, what the subject is, and then embed the data that's supposed to go into that email communication. And I'll build that out for the team to actually validate, because if I can just put that in there at the time that I am actually getting ready to build out some Power Automate flow, I will just copy and paste. And that's once again an asset that is getting put back on the business to make these decisions as to what to communicate. We're going to be collecting a lot of information all throughout, and we want to make sure that we're only sharing the right information to the right role at a specific point in time. Now, as you are rebuilding or building out this process, what you'll find is that there might be steps outside of this end-to-end process that you don't need to track, that you don't need to automate, that you don't need to do. But that step is something that does get done. As a good example, right between step number 2 and 4, I might automate a process that actually accounts for steps 1 through 6, except step 3. And step 3 involved that person in HR going to their system of record and looking something up. Now, do you have to do full integrations with other third-party systems? You really have to understand what the value is of a lot of that. If it involves just a reference, if it involves them just verifying, right, and as you're stepping through each one of these, you have to be challenged. You're going to challenge yourself as to say, where do I want to spend my time developing, right? So not every step in a business process needs to be automated within your solution. Consider those types of things. Yes. All right, let's talk about the data. So I like a very simple schema, once again, as part of an asset that I put back in the business as we're developing these requirements and looking at their examples and understanding the data that we're going to collect. I'm going to look at and identify absolutely what fields I need, right, to collect, where they're coming from or where I'm going to get them, where they're going to be introduced, and how they're going to be used. Simple spreadsheet, push this back on the user, right, on the business to validate and verify. In a lot of cases, I might create things like in SharePoint. I still create calculated columns. Why? Because I want to reference the same date, times, the same, I want to be able to have the users be able to use something in Excel a lot easier, and they don't have to go do extra stuff. So I I do a lot of simple calculated columns around date fields. Okay? But identifying this data and pushing this back on them is easy for them to say, oh, what about this? And when I am identifying that, if it's a choice, there might be another part of the schema that I'm building out, a schema document that identifies, what about these fields, right? What type of fields they are. If it is a choice, what are the choice options? What are the defaults to that? And once again, right, that I share back with the customer. Now, where these sources are coming from also becomes important. Right? I am housing all this data in a SharePoint list in the solution that I'm talking about. But not everything is entered into that list. And in fact, some of it comes from different stages, right? Let's say there's these 6 stages of a process. Not everything is going to be entered in for that particular record on stage 1. So knowing where the data is going to come from, forms, a profile, approvals, right? Automated fields, lookup fields, whatever that may be, is going to be very good for you. It's going to help you as you're stepping through and beginning to build. The more you do this, the less questions you're going to have to, right, stop and ask someone. If your organization utilizes or has a really clean and up-to-date Active Directory, you can use that to your benefit by all means. In many cases, when you are asking questions in a form or someone is having to fill something out, is there a need to ask for things like job title or department or office? If some of those, or manager, if a lot of that stuff is valid in the Active Directory, and you can bring them into your sort, right into your data. So know more about the data and where you're getting it and how you're going to use it. Now we'll continue on with this. There's so many apps in 365 and solutions we develop, they aren't done in silo. Not everything is managed and created and whatever in SharePoint. Not everything is done in Excel. Not everything is done in Power Automate. So know exactly what you're going to use, understand what the right app is for this overall solution. And remember, you might use different apps absolutely at different points in time, and not every user might interact with that data through those apps, right, through every single one of these apps. It's important to know it is also important to understand what your license provides you. Right? There's nothing worse than developing a solution and wrapping it around applications that not all users have access to, and that the organization would incur a cost to use those apps. So make sure you understand what apps you're going to use. If there is a cost to them, you have to put some sort of cost justification in place, as to why you're going to recommend the organization to go and upgrade a license or do any of that. All right, so we'll continue on with this. Now, right, regarding the apps, absolutely, we have to be careful as to what apps we invest in this solution. Understanding what the pros and the cons are to each one of these apps, right? Is this particular app right for your solution? Because with so many apps, I could choose one app over the other. It just depends on what your requirements are, right? Of course, what we just mentioned, what's included in your license. If you're introducing a new app, you have to consider also, right, the time to provide training. You have to make sure that you have to understand how people are going to use something, because you can't make assumptions about how they will use it. So if you are depending on a user automatically tagging something in a team, or using a specific hashtag, some of these things are not controllable. So you have to look at the data that you're trying to that you're trying to extract at any given time, but also as part of your solution, if you're integrating this and using like Power Automate to move things through a process, what's going to add complexity? One, in all of this, does it work for the user? And also, does it work for the solution? All right. Now, collecting data, you have so many different ways that you can actually collect information in here. Some of the most basic ways, right? A form. You can still use a list, right? You can make it a Power App. You can use Teams. You can use Yammer, whatever that might be. Uh, but you have to define also what the experience is, right? If it's controllable. And as you're stepping through each one of these, is there more complexity for one versus the other in your development of your solution? And right, the long-term support of this. So if you decide that you're going to, utilize Yammer as a good example, and it's not rolled out to the organization, which I kind of touched base on this in that last slide, so I feel like I'm saying the same thing over. But you kind of understand this point of, you have to know what each one of these things does, and how you're going to control the experience and the implication to it, to what you're building and the long-term support of that. Now, one thing we'll touch base on too is documentation. There's a lot of stuff we just talked about, from identifying the flows, right, listening to the business problem, putting a document schema in place, creating a Visio. You should create a repository of this solution, about how this solution works, any intricacies about the solution, accounts that are used, applications that are used, and document that, because you want this to be something that can be supported, whether you're continuing to develop this or not. And in fact, for a lot of people that do develop solutions, going back to this documentation might be helpful, because if you're continuing to build more and more things, sometimes they end up kind of blurring together. Right? So you can make videos for an end user, a very short video that says, hey, this is how you have to do something, fill this out and do this. Short videos that really break down the solution and explain the solution from a team management perspective, right? This is what we're doing here. This is what we're doing here. This is the whole solution. And then absolutely, you can have a feedback loop from both the people that are managing the solution, to the end users, right? The ones that are interacting, that might give you your first round of data. What works, what doesn't? Can this solution continue without you being there? Can you be gone a week on vacation? And if you can't, why is that? right? So you need to document a lot of these things about whether you have back-end processes that are on a server, right? That you've made it as a dependency. And if that server by chance was decommissioned or that server, is down and that process didn't run, then your entire solution is hooked to that. All right, so we'll continue on with this as well. The next slide we're talking about is visualization. Right, as part of every solution that we have, you have to wrap some reporting aspect as part of an end-to-end solution. Whether you use Excel, whether you use some reporting platform, Tableau, outside, Power BI, whatever it may be, and you account for in there the various roles that you are dealing with, right? Depending on the data or the solution that you have, you might have a small subset where I need to see my stuff and my manager and they need to see their team stuff. And you continue that on. So understanding that, getting the requirements, understanding the visual aspect of it, of how we're going to share this. In many cases, absolutely, the reporting aspect is what drove the adoption of the solution. What drove the executives to say, we like this data, we want to continue to see this, and why hasn't this continued, right? Why hasn't anyone updated this as of last week? So the better your reporting capabilities are and the more visibility there is to the data that you're sharing for, right, whatever the business process, it is absolutely, without a doubt, one way that you can gain adoption just by visualizing it. It also provides you some opportunity to kind of have the team, right, the senior leadership, whoever, look at this information in a much different way. And I'll give you a good example before we go to our last slide, and that is I built a dashboard, and that dashboard was for a call center, and that call center, showed what their bonuses were by team, right, by region, and so on and so forth. And they measured that only across 4 different things. And one of the things I introduced was I showed and visualized 2 other measures in there, right? To say, oh, did you know that the guy that isn't it interesting that the person that is number 1 across those 4 measures, which gave them the biggest bonus for the last prior 2 years, that same person is the number 1 in these 2 other categories. He was the number 1 guy to um, uh, uh, give discounts, right? He had the highest volume in discounts. He gave away the most discounts, mainly on shipping. And then the other one that he did was he actually had the highest number of deletions. So what you find is that sometimes what people report on in that solutions and reporting, you want to be able to provide your users a really good visual to not only see the data as they see it from the data that's captured, but also flipping that data around and introducing other things for them to be able to see, right, and gain more value out of that. The other thing I'd recommend about this, whether you're using like Power BI or something, is that you want your data to be as dynamic as possible. Right? The more you introduce manual processes where reporting is dependent upon, and of course, right, you've got to go on vacation and then the dashboard doesn't get updated, right, the more painful that can become. So be as dynamic as possible in your reporting aspect so that it's hooked to things that are live, right? And yeah, but I've absolutely have always found that the visualization aspect has driven the adoption of solutions. Okay, so in this example, right, what are we going to be solving, right? What we're going to look at. The business problem is really around recognition. It's something I've actually built a number of times in different ways for different organizations. The employee recognition program that requires too much hand-holding. Right, employees are sending their recognition in via email, and HR would forward it to supervisors and executives for approval. Oftentimes, they wouldn't include all the information we needed in the email, so we would have to chase the information down. Right, it was time-consuming, inefficient, and had poor reporting for HR leadership and the executive team. One of the other things about this particular solution is that there's two aspects to it. One is informal, right? Just the an organization supporting a method or mechanism for their employees just to say thank you. And the other one is the more formal collection of information, which is around a recognition associated to some award or monetary, right, or swag or whatever that may be. So in most cases, you find that recognition has two aspects to it, the informal and a more formal. Okay, so let's talk about the solution that we have, right? And just last slide here, and then we're going to go jump to um, our 365 world. So I picked Yammer for informal recognition. We'll talk about why. I used a form for the award recognition, right? This form is actually created as part of the group, so it's not visible to everyone, only via a link. I embedded that form via a page on the intranet, and I tagged that page. I'm able to share it a lot easier. It's part of my intranet, right? And it becomes findable because I've tagged it. And when I prefer to say the word findable instead of searchable, right? It becomes findable because I have this form embedded on this page. We'll look at all this stuff. Teams or Outlook for approvals. It just depends. If you're not a Teams, right, focused organization, then approvals will go through Outlook. Outlook to communicate various parties, right, various parties throughout. So if you recall during that, right, the first part of the flow and that Word document where you identified, right, what was going to be embedded inside an email communication, right, this is the step that I'm talking about. Of course, a team, Microsoft team, to manage the actual solution, and with that in that team, a SharePoint list to hold the data throughout the process. A Power Automate flow, a series of flows. We'll talk more about that specifically. Power BI dashboard to visualize the data. All right, so that's what our solution looks like. Now let's go take a look. Now I mentioned, right, Yammer. It just depends on whether your organization is already using Yammer. I like Yammer. I think it's been around for a long time. It has a much different purpose than Teams does. It has different, right, interactions. And one of the biggest things I like about the being able to use Yammer is the fact that you can actually embed a Yammer feed on an intranet page. Now, I've designed intranets for companies that don't use Yammer, and I've designed intranets for companies that have used Yammer. And one of the things I've always recommended for those that use Yammer is that we embed some, right, that feed, the feed, whether it's recognition or it's the feed that I've deployed a solution that just says, right, happy birthday, happy anniversary, whatever that might be. It's a social aspect that some companies really like about this. Right, so in this case, embedding that Yammer feed on an intranet page, great, works great. And once again, if I bring them to this homepage of an intranet where they're finding other information as it is, and they can have access to global, right, this global navigation and other resources, and they can also utilize it for recognition. All right, so Yammer, number one, in terms of that informal recognition. Now the formal recognition, I just picked the form. The form works well for the most part, right? There's some little quirks to a form, and you have to utilize it sometimes Power Automate to kind of get around these things, right? To check. But ultimately, you have some solid branching capabilities in here. You know, in the options that I have, and a lot of how I might design is especially if you're dealing with multi-choice. As you can see, there's a different value that a person selects after each one of these. I call this like category and subcategory. Well, in my source data and not, my SharePoint list, I don't have 4 extra subcategory fields. I actually have a category field and I have a subcategory field. And whatever this value is, when I pass it back, it only writes to one list. So yeah, you might have some extra fields in your form to accommodate choices and accommodate, right, branching, but that doesn't mean your source data necessarily has to have as many of those columns. You just have to be smart about kind of how you're mapping things. All right, so talked about our form. We talked about Yammer. The form itself, depending on what you're doing, of course, this form was created as part of the team. And it's not, there's no way a person can go find it if they don't have access to this team, which is why I choose to also, right, get that link and I can embed that on a page itself. Now, the reason why I embed it on a page is because now I can tag this page. I can put this page on a website, right, on some site on the intranet, wherever. I can share this page and send this out. I can do a number of these things, and this page is now searchable. So if I have a new hire employee and they know that there's a link, they're like, oh, I want to go say thank you to my HR onboarding team, but they have to go to forms, right? If you keep people siloed and you make them go to forms for something or SharePoint for something, right? Just a silo world versus using your intranet to bring things together. Right? This is where you can say, oh, this is actually this page is accessible under the new hire, right, top nav, or it's a link on your home page as a button, whatever that might be in terms of right, sharing out this page. Right? So we talked about our form. Now let's jump into our list. So we have the SharePoint site collection that was created, and this list has this schema. Now remember that the form itself only has X number of fields. It doesn't have a ton of fields, right? But all of a sudden I have this list that has a lot more fields. That doesn't mean that a person is, person that's running or managing the solution has to go in there and fill it out. In fact, you have fields that might be introduced throughout the life of a record via the workflow, right? Via Power Automate. So the first set of approvals is going to write this section. And then on the next pass, the next part of it is the supervisor approval. Once you get that feedback from that Power Automate in that approval, it's going to keep updating the same record. So the record itself will build over time, right? And this is why it's important to understand the process, to document that process, because we're going to turn around and have to implement that and try to use Power Automate in some way. Power Automate, I found to be a great app. It allows you to bridge a lot of things. Whether you want to be one of these people that build huge and massive Power Automate flows, I have preferred to break mine up a little bit more. And it's as simple as, open and closed successful steps. What I mean by that is you can have in a big, huge process, you can have 4 levels of approval, and it might take that record 2 weeks to be completed. Right? 2 weeks for something to be open versus parts of the process, opening and closing. Right? Step 1, I receive the record, go do something. Step 2, I'm sending this out for HR approval, and they're supposed to check, right, that one step outside that's not automated. And then they're going to come back and approve something. Of course, I broke something here with my flow. And then step 3, as we kind of step through every one of these, right, I like to break up these flows because they're not then so huge. So if I'm looking at, step number 2, this is the first approval. And in this approval, I'm doing something and, right, it opens, it closes. It's probably because I just updated my password. Very likely. And when I'm doing that, absolutely, I don't have this big, huge sprawl of a workflow. Right. I also think about from a development perspective, who's going to manage this after me? Who might come in after me to update this flow, whether I leave the company or I've taken a new role. And if you can break this out a little bit more, it also becomes easier for anyone that is managing it, right? Even the admins to be able to go and say, hey, there's an error. We have an error on step number 3, manager approval. Can you help us with that? Sure, absolutely, absolutely. Happy to, happy to. Now, there are things that you can bridge in, right? You can do in here. This is where we talked about introducing a user profile, right? Going and hooking up to your Azure, your AD, and pulling in individual properties, right? If your AD is clean, you have a lot of data that you can bring in and begin to fill this record. And we don't necessarily, just because you have something doesn't mean it has to go into your source, right? Into your list. You look for things that will be driven by what you have to report on, what you have to show, right? And visibility that you have to have. And that's the type of data that we need to bring into this record, right? If we can bring it into the record with Power Automate, great. Without someone having to, right, enter in that information, I think that becomes beneficial all around. All right, we'll continue on with one of our last steps in here, which is the data visualization aspect. Once again, I'm using Power BI in this solution, and I'm embedding it on a page, as you can see. A lot of that just depends on where things are going to be accessed. So you can absolutely embed dashboards on a page, especially if it's on within the same team, right? If you are in Teams and you are adding this dashboard so that the team can actually see it. When we talk about the dashboard, I kind of mentioned this before, right? Oftentimes your visualization can drive adoption, right? The higher they are in, the higher you are in creating these views based upon role, and the more valuable this dashboard might become to someone looking at it, right, once a week. And if that's the case, they're going to then say, why hasn't this changed? And then they're going to tell everyone. And this isn't just for this particular solution, but if we were looking at this, and I don't know why, but my Power BI is not, yeah, for some reason it's not loading. But interestingly enough, I am able to actually, let me just do this. There we go. If it doesn't work one way, we'll get it to work another. Um, so when you're creating these dashboards, how you publish them, where you publish them becomes important. Right, you're creating a file, you're using a particular source, maybe you're publishing it back into the executive leadership team, and you're accounting for the access to the data. But at the same time, too, you have to make another one by department. This is for my department, and I only see that. So think about the different levels. For the big picture, we consider, right, one big view. Tell me what's going right, or tell me what's going wrong. If this is not what it should be, I should have some mechanism to filter on that and to see that and to say, to highlight that. Because someone can then just say, hey, why is this doing this the way it is? Across department, whether it's a department or job title or this or that, team, office, region, having the various views always helps. This is so basic. This is such a basic dashboard, but I think the point being we want different views across this, across time. How much did I do this day versus this week, this month, this year, or even in comparison to the same time last year? Incorporate filters. They can be the same, instead of it being vertical, you can have horizontal filters. Right, this is all part of how you want to basically design and how people are going to interact with this data. Part of that, right, has to kind of be considered. Also, right, this is that raw output that right, this is just the raw output. Oftentimes, people that don't have access to the raw data, um, you want to give them this output. They can actually go do something with it with Excel, but this should become the system of record, right? This is the system of record. What I mean by the system of record, the dashboard itself, this should not necessarily system of record, right? This is actually, your list becomes the system of record, but this is the place where all of the requirements, where all of the numbers that for people outside of the process are going to be looking at this data. So you can incorporate, right, various views depending on the audience to this whole thing. So All right, so we've talked a lot about this solution, end-to-end consideration for a solution. It incorporates a lot. By all means, it incorporates our ability to consider how people will get to what we want them to do, where they will do it, how they're going to find that easily, right? And then the process itself of actually getting and moving something through steps, the stages of a solution, the stages of a business process, and utilizing the right tools for the right thing. Could you use another workflow tool? Yes, there's a couple out there that integrate with 365. I'm not saying don't use them. I'm just, right, in this case, this by chance, this is all things that are within, I think, an E5 license or potentially an E3 plus Power BI. How are we going to share this data if it's going to be on 365? Right, the complexities of any particular app that we choose. I could have used a Microsoft team, a public team, and created the same thing. The only difference is they would have to be in teams all the time. They would only be able to go through it with teams, and I couldn't share this information, on my intranet as well in terms of this very simple this this very simple web part right here. Okay. So consider all of the roles that are there, how you're going to present them. Right, this isn't necessarily a final view of anything. I think what we've looked at are bits and pieces of how things are connected. We've talked a lot about things to consider as you are developing, but truthfully, a lot of the work that we're doing when we develop solutions is that sorry, that's my daughter. A lot of the solutions that we develop um, are, yeah, and I just lost my train of thought on that one because my daughter. Okay, let me just say that again. A lot of the solutions that we develop, we listen a lot more than anything else, right? We listen to the problem, consider that problem, validate what we think we've heard, challenge our own architecture with both security, apps, what's available, the training that might be needed, the level of investment that it's going to take to build the solution end to end within 365. And then we push that back on a business team, and hopefully they've become more educated as to the process. And if that's the case, and we've documented the solution, and we've provided the right, and involved the right people, this solution that you have should last, it should live on beyond you, that you should be able to go on vacation without having to introduce or saying to someone, can you please go do X, Y, and Z? The solution should live on and should be available to and work the exact same way whether a whole new group of people were being onboarded, right? And they didn't know anything other than to go somewhere and fill this data out. There should be no dependencies on things that would make your solution or the solution that for this organization too complex to continue on without you. Right? So, all right. Well, thank you guys so very much. I'm happy to have shared this architectural considerations for an end-to-end solution. And I think you may have heard a little bit of background noise, but ooh, it's no big deal, right? Okay. Thanks and have a great day.